The cold metal walls of Nova Terra trembled as the hum of machinery echoed through the sprawling megacity. Kale Vargon stood at the edge of the command tower, staring out into the endless void. The stars beyond were distant, unreachable, like a dream that had long since turned to ash. For Kale, this was his reality. Exiled, abandoned, and forgotten by the galaxy. "Commander, the systems are reporting low energy reserves on the outer rings. We're pushing close to critical," came the voice of Lieutenant Kira Salen, her tone as stern and sharp as always. Kale's gaze didn't waver from the darkness outside. He'd grown accustomed to the hum of dying power cores, the rusting edges of a once proud civilization now hanging on by a thread. The same could be said for humanity. They were a shadow of what they had once been, a war machine broken and scattered across the farthest corners of the galaxy. "Send a team to secure the generators. We'll buy ourselves another day," Kale replied, his voice low, almost detached. "How much longer until the Rift device is ready?" Kira's silence lingered for a moment before she responded, her voice more careful now. "Commander, it's still unstable. We don't know what kind of damage it could do if activated." Kale turned, his expression cold. He'd heard this before. But there was no time for hesitation anymore. The Rift device, the key to humanity's return, was their last hope, a device capable of tearing a hole in the fabric of space, pulling them back into the galaxy that had cast them aside. "Stability is irrelevant," Kale said, stepping closer to her. "We're on borrowed time. The galaxy left us to die, Kira. It's time we made them regret it." Kira met his gaze. There was doubt in her eyes, but also a quiet respect. Kale wasn't just any leader, he was the one who had held humanity together when everything else had fallen apart. He had fought the wars, bled for them, and watched countless friends and soldiers die in the process. His drive to rebuild humanity's place in the galaxy was unwavering. But Kale wasn't sure he could ever explain to her what drove him, what drove them all. The pain. The loss. The sense that every step forward only led to another fight. No one would understand until they saw it through his eyes. "Commander," Kira said, her voice shaking him from his thoughts. "If we open the rift, we might not be able to control it. The instability could destroy everything." Kale's gaze hardened. "Better to burn this galaxy to the ground than let them sit in their ivory towers while we rot in the dark." Kira sighed, nodding reluctantly. "I'll inform the team. We'll prepare to initiate the sequence, but," she hesitated before adding, "I need to warn you. Some of the counselors are pushing to abandon the device entirely. They're afraid of what it could bring." "Let them fear," Kale muttered, already turning back to face the stars. "We've been fearing for too long." The command room was a battlefield in its own right. A war of words, of policies, of ideologies. The counselors, once humanity's leaders, now reduced to bickering figures, sat around a large, metal table. Their faces were lined with age and wear, their eyes clouded with the burden of failure. They had failed to protect humanity when it mattered most, and now they were debating whether or not to use the one weapon that could potentially return them to the galaxy. Kale strode into the room, his presence alone quieting the heated conversation. His eyes scanned the room, settling on the faces of his old comrades. These were the people he had once trusted. But trust was a luxury they could no longer afford. "Enough," Kale's voice cut through the tension, his tone harsh and commanding. "There's no more time for debate. The Rift device will be activated. The galaxy will pay for exiling us." Counselor Garen, an older man with thinning white hair, shot to his feet. "You're mad, Kale. We've spent decades surviving here. We have no idea what could happen if we open that rift. It could bring ruin to all of us." Kale's gaze locked onto Garen's, cold and unyielding. "I would rather face ruin than sit in this graveyard for another century." Another counselor, a woman named Tira Zane, stood up. Her posture was rigid, her hands clasped in front of her. "Kale, you know the risks. You understand the power that device wields. If we go back to the galaxy, we might face more enemies than we can handle. The coalition might be done with us, but there are factions out there that won't hesitate to wipe us out once they know we're coming. Cale's fists clenched at his sides. Tira's words echoed the same concerns that had been plaguing him for years. But he couldn't afford to back down. Not now. Let them come. We'll burn their fleets to ash. We've been weak for too long. It's time we reminded them of who we are. Tira's eyes narrowed, and for a brief moment, Cale saw something flicker in her gaze, a hesitation. It was a fleeting thing, gone in an instant. But Cale didn't miss it. He knew Tira's past, knew her loyalties. But now was not the time for questions. Now was the time for action. I've made my decision, Cale said, his voice final. Prepare the device. We move forward. A murmur of dissent rippled through the council. But Cale's gaze swept across the room, locking with each of their eyes. No one dared challenge him. Not now. The Rift device was nestled deep within the heart of Nova Terra, a vast chamber filled with the hum of old, ancient machines. It was a relic from an era long forgotten, crafted by an unknown civilization before humanity's rise. It was their final chance. The last hope. As Cale entered the chamber, the device loomed before him, a massive structure that seemed almost alive. Its core pulsed with a dark, foreboding energy, and the air around it crackled with power. The blueprint said it could tear a hole in the fabric of reality itself, but it was an unstable, unpredictable force. You sure about this, Cale? Kira's voice broke through the tension. He didn't respond at first. His gaze was locked on the device, his mind racing with possibilities, what it could do, what it might bring. Was this the right choice? He didn't know. But in that moment, he realized he didn't care anymore. The galaxy had written their fate, cast them aside like refuse. If he had to burn the universe to the ground to make them see, then so be it. I'm sure, Cale finally said, stepping closer to the device. Humanity will have its place. And if I have to carve it out with blood and fire, then that's what I'll do. The countdown began, a low rumble that vibrated through the entire megacity. Cale's hand hovered over the activation switch, his heart pounding in his chest. His mind flashed back to the days when humanity had fought side by side with the galaxy, when they had stood proud and strong. But that was before the betrayal, before the exile. Now, there was only one thing left to do, exact revenge. The Rift device hummed to life, and as Cale pressed the button, a burst of energy surged outward, threatening to tear the very fabric of reality. But just as the Rift began to open, a voice rang out, sharp and commanding. Stop! Cale's hand froze, and for the first time in years, his blood ran cold. Tira Zane stood at the doorway, her expression hard and unwavering. You're making a mistake. Cale's fingers curled into a fist as he turned to face Tira. His expression was stone, his eyes unreadable, but beneath the surface, his blood burned. The countdown echoed through the chamber, the low hum of the Rift device intensifying. He didn't have time for this. You're in the way, Zane. His voice was cold, edged with warning. Tira took a step closer, unshaken. You activate that device, and you risk tearing this entire station apart. You know it's unstable. You know what it could do. Cale let out a slow exhale, tilting his head slightly, studying her. What I know is that we have two choices. We either die here in the dark, or we take back what's ours. Tira's gaze sharpened. And what if opening the rift doesn't lead to salvation? What if it leads to another war we can't win? The Coalition exiled us for a reason, Cale. They were afraid of what we could become. And now, you want to prove them right. Cale took a deliberate step forward, closing the space between them. Damn right, I do. The weight of his words hung between them like a blade. The hum of the machine grew louder, the air around them charged with energy. Cale could see it in her eyes, the doubt, the conflict. But there was something else too. A flicker of hesitation. The kind that only came when someone had already made their decision. His fingers twitched toward his sidearm. I should have known, he muttered, more to himself than to her. You never wanted us to fight back. Tira's jaw tightened. I wanted us to survive. Kale laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. Survival? We've been clawing at the edges of extinction for decades. This isn't survival, Tira. It's stagnation. You want to keep us buried here because you're afraid of what comes next. She lifted her chin, unwavering. No. I'm afraid of what you'll do if we go back. Kale's patience snapped. Then you're already lost. His hand shot to his sidearm, but before he could draw, Tira moved. A blur of motion, her blade flashing free from her belt. Kale twisted, dodging just as the knife slashed past his ribs. The air around them crackled, not just from the rift device but from the collision of two warriors who had once fought side by side. The chamber erupted into chaos. Kale countered, swinging his arm up to knock the blade away. Tira was fast, faster than he remembered. But he wasn't just fast. He was relentless. He drove forward, his elbow slamming into her ribs, sending her staggering back. You knew I wouldn't let this happen, she panted, regaining her footing. That's why you didn't tell me everything. Kale wiped the back of his hand across his mouth, tasting iron. I didn't tell you because I knew you'd do something stupid. She smirked, the corner of her lip curling upward. Like stopping you? Kale lunged. Their blades clashed, sparks flying as steel met steel. The countdown echoed around them, each passing second bringing them closer to the moment Kale had been waiting for. The moment humanity would reclaim its place in the stars. Tira ducked under his next strike, twisting her blade toward his ribs. He barely dodged in time, pivoting to the side before shoving her back. This is pointless, Zane, he growled. You're not stopping this. Her breathing was heavy, her stance firm. I don't have to stop it, she said. Just delay it. Kale's eyes narrowed. Then he heard it, boots pounding against the metal floor. Reinforcements. His reinforcements. But there was something wrong. Their comms were silent. He flicked his gaze to Tira. She didn't need to say anything. The truth was already there, in the defiance burning behind her eyes. She had turned them. Kale exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening around the grip of his blade. You really thought you could outplay me? Tira rolled her shoulders, readying herself for another attack. No. I just needed to remind them who they're really fighting for. Kale's mind worked through the possibilities, recalculating his next move. The soldiers closing in weren't enemies. They were his men. His own damn people. And they weren't here to protect the rift device. They were here to stop him. The realization settled over him like a weight, but it didn't break him. It only hardened his resolve. If they had turned against him, it only meant one thing: he hadn't pushed them far enough. Kale raised his blade, leveling it at Tira. Then I'll remind them why they followed me in the first place. Tira's eyes darkened. I was afraid you'd say that. The moment shattered. The soldiers burst into the chamber, weapons drawn, shouting orders Kale had no intention of listening to. He moved fast, faster than they expected. In a single motion, he hurled his blade straight at the control panel. The impact sent a shockwave through the room. Sparks erupted, alarms blaring as the rift device surged. The chamber shook, the hum of energy turning into a roar. Kale turned back just in time to see Tira rushing him. He caught her wrist mid-swing, twisting her arm behind her back. She hissed in pain, but he didn't let go. The countdown was nearing its end. The device was unstable, but it was active. And that was all that mattered. You were right about one thing, Zane, he murmured into her ear. They exiled us because they feared what we could become. Now they'll see exactly what that looks like. Tira struggled against his grip, but she wasn't fast enough. Kale released her and stepped back, drawing his pistol in one smooth motion. He fired. Not at her. Not at the soldiers. At the last remaining failsafe of the rift device. The shot rang out like thunder, followed by a blinding flash of energy. The chamber shook violently, and then, with a deafening crack, the rift tore open. Everything went silent. Then came the screaming. The air twisted, reality bending around the edges of the rift. A swirling void of light and shadow yawned open before them, expanding outward, threatening to consume everything in its path. The soldiers staggered back, some shouting in terror, others frozen in awe. Cale stood firm, his gaze locked on the gateway he had just unleashed. Beyond the rift, a vision of the galaxy shimmered, familiar yet distant. And within that endless expanse, the unmistakable silhouette of warships loomed. Waiting. Cale's lips curled into a slow, predatory grin. He turned to Tira, who was still catching her breath, eyes wide with the weight of what had just happened. "You wanted to stop me," he said, voice calm, almost amused. "Too late." Tira's gaze snapped to the rift, horror dawning in her expression. "You don't understand. This isn't just a doorway, Cale. It's a beacon. You didn't just open a path, you sent a message." Cale tilted his head. "Good." Tira clenched her jaw, shaking her head. "You don't even know who's going to answer." Cale turned back toward the swirling abyss, his fingers flexing at his sides. The moment stretched, heavy with the weight of the unknown. Then, from the depths of the rift, something moved. A ship, sleek and unfamiliar, emerged from the void. Then another. And another. Cale's grin widened. "Looks like we're about to find out." The rift pulsed, its edges writhing like a living wound in the fabric of space. Cale stood tall, watching as the first of the unknown ships drifted forward, silent and deliberate. His soldiers hesitated, shifting uneasily, their weapons still raised but uncertain where to aim. Tira exhaled sharply. "You think this is victory?" Her voice was tight, laced with restrained fury. "You've just invited an unknown force into our last refuge." Cale barely spared her a glance. "Unknown doesn't mean unwelcome." Her fists clenched. "You arrogant bastard. What if they aren't here as allies?" Cale smirked. "Then we do what we've always done. We fight." A deep, resonant voice crackled through the chamber's comms, layered with an alien distortion. "Humanity." The words slithered through the air like an omen. Tira inhaled sharply, her face going pale. "They know what we are." Cale's grip tightened on his sidearm. "Then we're already a step ahead." Static hissed for a long moment before the voice spoke again. "You have opened the rift. You are either brave, or foolish." Cale tilted his head slightly, his pulse steady. "Depends on who's asking." A pause. Then, an eerie chuckle. "You do not know us. But we know you." The largest of the ships glided closer, and the chamber's warning lights flickered in response. "We have watched from the shadows of your exile. We know why your kind was cast out. And we know what you seek." Cale exchanged a glance with Tira. "Then you already know where this is going." A hum of amusement, deep and ancient. "Yes. You wish to reclaim the galaxy." Cale's smirk was razor-sharp. And, the voice darkened. "We wish to see if you are worthy." A second ship breached the rift, its design jagged and unfamiliar. Tira shifted her stance. "This isn't a negotiation. It's a test." Cale cracked his neck. "Good. I was getting bored." The alien voice rumbled with something between laughter and approval. "Then fight, human. Show us your fire." Cale lifted his comms to his mouth. "Battle stations." The chamber erupted into motion. His soldiers, though rattled, knew their duty. Orders rippled through the ranks, and Nova Terra's defenses surged to life. Automated turrets adjusted their aim, missile silos unlocked, and the city's fleet ignited their engines. Tira stepped in close, her voice low. "This is madness." Cale turned to her, eyes alight with something dangerous. "No. This is the proving ground." The alien ships didn't wait. Without warning, the lead vessel's hull shimmered, and a barrage of energy blasts tore through the rift. Alarms shrieked. Cale moved instantly. "Return fire." The command sent ripples through the fleet. Railguns thundered, Missiles streaked toward their targets, and the sky outside the station lit up in a maelstrom of destruction. Tara ducked behind cover, firing off commands through her own comms. You don't even know their strength. You're gambling with our survival. Kale's laugh was sharp, edged with something ruthless. Survival is a gamble, Zane. Always has been. He fired 3 quick shots at the approaching enemy drones, their sleek forms twisting unnaturally through the air before one finally collapsed in a burst of flame. The alien voice returned, unshaken. You are interesting. Kale grinned, adrenaline surging through his veins. You haven't seen anything yet. The rift pulsed again, growing, shifting. More ships. More adversaries. But Kale didn't waver. He stood at the heart of the chaos, the storm bending to his will. Tara's voice cut through the comms. They aren't trying to destroy us. Kale's brow furrowed. What? She ducked under a collapsed bulkhead, scanning the battlefield with sharp precision. Their attacks, they're calculated. Non-lethal. They could have wiped us out already, but they're holding back. Kale processed that in an instant. His lips curled. They really are testing us. The alien voice crackled back to life. You learn quickly, Kale Vargon. Kale's amusement flickered into something sharper. You know my name. A pause. Then, we know much more than that. For the first time, Kale's grip on his weapon tightened slightly. Then let's skip the games. The lead ship stilled. The chaos of battle froze, weapons humming but silent. Then, the alien voice spoke once more, calm and deliberate. You seek vengeance. Kale didn't blink. I seek justice. A dark chuckle. And you believe you are strong enough to take it? Kale lifted his chin. You tell me. A long silence stretched between them, the weight of something inevitable pressing against the walls of the chamber. Then, finally. We will see. And the rift expanded. Kale's breath was steady, but even he felt the shift in the air. Something ancient was waking. Something vast. Tara's voice was barely a whisper. What have you done? Kale's answer was simple. Exactly what I needed to. The rift pulsed violently. Kale's body stiffened, and his soldiers held their breath, knowing full well that this moment could either spell their doom or deliver them a future beyond their darkest nightmares. His eyes locked on the vast expanse of darkness opening before them, an endless void waiting to consume everything they had fought for. The air hummed, crackling with raw energy. It felt like the whole of Nova Terra was holding its breath. Kale, Tara's voice was tight, barely audible above the chaos. You're playing with forces beyond your comprehension. You've unleashed something dangerous. Kale didn't answer at first, his focus unwavering as he stared at the growing rift. The world outside seemed to vanish, leaving only the unearthly hum filling the void. His fingers twitched, itching for action, for the one moment of clarity that could shift the tide. He knew that this was the final move, the moment that would either make or break humanity's resurgence. I'm done playing, Kale said finally, his voice low, but razor sharp. He turned to face her, his eyes seething with the fire of 1,000 battles. You want peace? You want safety? There's no room for that anymore. We fight. We take back what's ours. Tara's gaze was torn between doubt and resolve, her features hardened by the pressure of the situation. We can't go back, Kale. We're already too far gone. His lips twisted into a grim smile. That's the point. We've never been farther from mercy. We've been exiled. We've been abandoned. And I'll be damned if I let them decide our fate again. A sudden burst of energy shattered the silence. The rift quaked, expanding once more as massive alien vessels poured through, dark and foreboding. Their presence was undeniable, vast, overpowering, a reminder of the forces humanity had always fought against. The battle was no longer just a war for survival, it was a war for existence itself. The ships loomed, blocking out stars, their weapons bristling with energy, and yet they held their fire. The threat was palpable. Every soldier in the room could feel it, the heavy weight of inevitability settling over them. Kale's comms buzzed to life, a voice cutting through the tension. "This is Commander Zane of Nova Terra's defense fleet. We are engaging the enemy. Stand by for orders." Kale took a breath, his thoughts as clear as steel. This was the moment. The ultimate gamble. "We don't wait for orders, Zane. We make our own." "Kale," Tira hissed, but the words were lost as he turned and ran for the command center's tactical console. His soldiers rallied, moving in sync, weapons ready, preparing to stand beside him no matter the cost. The rift crackled with energy, swelling like a storm cloud ready to burst. Kale slammed his fist onto the console, sending a burst of energy through the system. The megacity's massive weaponry roared to life in unison. Missile silos erupted with fiery trails as weapons hurled into the oncoming fleet, each explosion marking humanity's defiance. Kale's voice cut through the chaos like a sword through flesh. "This is it. Don't hold back. This isn't just about us anymore. This is for every soul exiled, every battle fought in the shadows. This is our time." The battle intensified. Energy blasts tore through the shipyard. The enemy ships retaliated, their weapons slicing through the night like the claws of a beast. Explosions shook the very foundations of Nova Terra. Through the smoldering chaos, Kale fought on, leading his troops into the storm. "More ships incoming," Zane's voice crackled again. "We can't hold them off much longer." "We don't have to hold them off," Kale shouted, raising his gun and firing into the oncoming hordes of drones. The noise was deafening, a cacophony of war, but Kale's focus never wavered. "We go on the offensive. We push them back." The ground rumbled beneath their feet as Nova Terra's megaflare cannon charged, its energy building to a catastrophic potential. Kale felt it in his bones. This weapon could change everything. The rift's ever-expanding darkness was their adversary, but the flare, Kale believed, was their salvation. They could break it open. They could pierce the heart of their enemies. But then, a voice that was not human pierced his thoughts, sharp and cold. "You are nothing but a pawn, Kale Vargon. You do not understand the forces you are meddling with." Kale's blood ran cold. The voice was familiar, it was the same one that had taunted him earlier. The alien presence, more powerful than anything he had anticipated, was close. But where? From the rift, a new figure emerged. A towering, hulking alien, draped in dark, ancient armor that glowed with a malevolent light. His eyes, pitch black, bore into Kale's soul. The being was monstrous, its form unnatural, shifting between shapes as though it were not truly bound by the laws of space. It spoke again, its voice a slow and deliberate caress. "We warned you, human. You are a fool to seek vengeance." Kale's heart thudded in his chest. He stepped forward, his voice calm, but each word was a battle. "Then let me show you how a fool fights." With that, he triggered the megaflare cannon. A blinding beam shot from the weapon, lighting up the entire sector. The beam sliced through the rift like a hot knife through butter, cutting into the alien vessel and tearing through its defenses. The explosion that followed sent shockwaves rippling outward, shaking everything in its path. But the battle wasn't over. The alien being moved with unnatural speed, its form shifting and twisting like a nightmare come to life. It raised its hand, and the debris from the explosion froze in midair. Kale's eyes widened. "Not good." Tira's voice was cold and steady. "We can't win this fight with weapons alone." Kale gritted his teeth. "Then we do what we do best, we fight dirty." As the alien being loomed closer, Kale moved with deadly precision. His soldiers followed, every one of them locked in a desperate battle for survival. The alien retaliated, its power overwhelming, but Kale pushed on. No retreat. No surrender. Tira's hand shot out, her voice seething with fury. "Kale, stop. This ends now. We don't know what they're capable of." Kale spun, meeting her gaze with a fire that could burn the stars. "It ends when we decide it ends." He raised his weapon. "For humanity." The final assault was launched, and all hell broke loose. The alien being's forces surged forward, but Kale's soldiers fought with unrelenting fury. Kale himself moved through the battlefield, a force of nature, leaving destruction in his wake. With each strike, the galaxy seemed to tremble. "You will regret this," the alien whispered. But Kale never faltered. "No. This is our war now."